So it's a great pleasure and a great opportunity to be able to share with you some of the research that I've been doing as a social scientist specializing in political communication and public opinion. Most people who do research in my area focus almost exclusively on elections and also kind of what you consider the traditional political areas, trying to figure out, for example, how does the media shape attitudes about abortion? How does the media shape choices about who to vote for in a presidential election? Outside of public opinion, how does the media relate to big policy decisions such as Social Security and other aspects? But when I was in graduate school at Cornell, because of the nature of the program at Cornell, some of the faculty I was able to work with, and also my own personal interests, I began to develop a research program in applying what we've learned about political communication generally in the context of elections and these other overtly political topics to thinking about these emerging and increasingly more frequent and divisive science policy debates. So I'm going to present some research to you, both some research that I've done and other findings that other people have found. I'm going to lay out some assertions that might challenge some prevailing assumptions and also a framework for understanding how the public makes up their mind about these issues and the role of the media that also might challenge some prevailing assumptions. So I look forward to the question and answer period and also a really good discussion. And let's see if this, okay. So tonight I'm going to first, just briefly review what the traditional models of science and communication might say, and then talk about how these traditional models of communication are increasingly challenged by changes in the media system itself, and also the tactics of media strategists as they work on these science policy debates, and also how these traditional models of science communication actually might cut against a lot of the research in public opinion and political communication, which is really across a couple disciplines, including communication and political science, that's been trying to kind of achieve a scientific understanding of the public and how the public reasons about these kind of complex topics that are often remote from their daily lives. And I'm going to use examples based on issues that I've looked at, trying to think about generalizable patterns across these topics. But I'm going to use the examples of climate change, intelligent design, stem cell research, and plant biotechnology. And then after presenting some of that, I'm going to talk about, well, other than the traditional models of science and communication that remain probably centrally important, can we think about complementary forms of engagement with the public? And this takes on this key concept of what's called framing research, which some of you might have heard about. It's really popular in kind of the political lexicon now, and I'll talk about what that means. But then also not only thinking about communication strategy, but also how can we work with journalists in rethinking some media norms about how you define what is science news and how you communicate about the public through the mass media. Okay, so that as many of you know, that kind of the prevailing model is a focus on science literacy, both through formal science education and investment in science education, but also through what's called the popular science model. Maybe Carl Sagan is the icon of the popular science model, and this is this idea that through science media and popular forms of science in the mass media, you informally educate the public about science. And the more that the public understands about science, the higher the levels of their scientific literacy, the more supportive they are, the more they view issues as scientists. And if you increase scientific literacy, a lot of these controversies are likely to go away, a lot of the public resistance. And science education remains a central mission, and science literacy is very important. But what I'm going to argue tonight is when thinking about these really overtly political topics, how the public makes up its in the short term about climate change, about stem cell research, about intelligent design, a narrow focus just on science literacy can be distracting, especially when thinking about communication strategy, even though it remains a very important long-term institutional goal. Along with scientific literacy, focus on scientific literacy and popular science, an alternative model that's developed is the public engagement model. And this is a focus on more of a two-way interaction. So instead of the transfer of knowledge from the scientific community to the public, this is including things like town meetings, deliberative forums, where you gather interested and involved and highly motivated citizens, often stakeholders in an issue, right? And you talk to them about their concerns, right? And scientists and administrators gain input from the public that then shapes the policy outcomes, hopefully, perhaps, but also importantly increases citizen efficacy, and it increases their sense that this is a fair process. And oftentimes, though people might disagree with the actual outcome of the policy-making decision, if they believe the decision-making was fair, then they're more likely to go along with it. And so this is also another important turn in thinking about public engagement strategy. But for a number of different reasons, when thinking about these overtly political topics now, and engaging what I call the mass public, the wider public outside of a few interested stakeholders, it remains still just an incomplete model. Okay, so as one of the reasons that the public engagement models remain incomplete is the question of who are you engaging, right? In a study that's coming out in a journal called Political Behavior, we asked people in a national survey, would you be willing to turn out and participate in a local deliberative forum about stem cell research? And what you found in politics generally is that the people who are most likely to turn out are the already engaged, right? And also the already information rich. These are people from a high socioeconomic background, but also interesting on stem cell research, it was the church mobilized. It was people that also reported they're receiving information within churches, right? So these are the people that feel very intensely about the issue. So the situation that you have then in these public forums, these small public forums at the local level or the regional level, is that the people that are turning out are not representative of the larger public, right? It's the people that you don't necessarily need already to reach. They serve certain functions in kind of ameliorating polarization because people feel that the issue is more fair and they feel that they're being listened to. But in terms of about the wider public, it remains still incomplete. Many of you are familiar with the National Science Foundation Science Indicators Project, right? This is shifting from the public engagement model back to the science literacy model. And as you know, this is a focus on technical knowledge, and they've been tracked over several decades, levels of both technical knowledge about science, but also an understanding of how science is done, right? How science is a process. And they asked a series of true and false questions, multiple choice questions about these topics. And what they generally find, and Melissa Pollock is in room today, what's been the principal author on several of these chapters, is what most people assume is that there is this correlation between levels of knowledge about science, right, and people's general attitudes about science and society, right? And so these are, this is along here you have scores in terms of numbers of questions answered correctly, and then here you have percent agreement with we depend too much on science and not enough on faith, so as knowledge increases, right, agreement with that item goes down. Here, as knowledge increases, agreement with the second item, science makes our way of life change too fast. Again, agreement with that item also declines. Right, so people feel more positive in these surveys. Technical knowledge of science is correlated with general attitudes about science, and it's a positive correlation with more positive views. Okay, but what's interesting is in every data set that I've looked at a lot of the NSF science indicators data. I've kind of poured over them starting in graduate school. I've published papers using that data. I've collected data of my own where I've gathered and I've asked about technical scientific literacy. And you always almost find this positive correlation between technical knowledge and general attitudes about science. But what's interesting is that you have this positive correlation, but invariably across these data sets, what you find is there's much stronger influences, and those are based on people's religious beliefs, oftentimes their political views in terms of their partisanship, but also their ideology. And what's important is that, and this was confirmed in a forthcoming paper in the Journal of Public Understanding of Science, which was a meta-analysis of a lot of these surveys that have been done internationally, not only in the United States and Canada, but also Europe and Japan. What's interesting is because these other variables are so strong, as I'll talk about, they serve as perceptual lenses, right? And when these issues become overtly political, right, these demographic factors such as religious beliefs, political values, these value predispositions, right, a lot of the available information out there in the mass media is reinterpreted through these lenses, right? So, why? Because as I argue, science policy debates, there's nothing essentially unique about science policy debates from other political debates. All right? Science does have some essentially unique aspects to it as an institution, but when these issues get out there in the public sphere and become highly politically contentious, right, they're just like any other policy, any other type of policy issue, or also how people make up their minds about who to vote for. And a very influential book in political communication and political science is this book called The Reasoning Voter by Samuel Popkin, who's a political scientist at UC San Diego. And in fact, actually, he's kind of a cult figure among political consultants, both on the left and the right. And what Samuel Popkin argues is that, well, actually, it's actually quite reasonable and rational for your average citizen to not be fully informed, right? It takes a lot of time. And many citizens may not have the motivation or the ability to be fully informed about a political issue or a science policy issue. Instead, they rely on information shortcuts, heuristics, right? The way they make up their minds about the president is not about their positions on policy, right, but rather their character, all right? A lot of it is based on leadership competency and in their image of what type of person they might be. So, you know, these type of iconic images of John Kerry windsurfing or Michael Dukakis in a tank, right? Or this later on, and more recently in Bush's presidency, this idea that, you know, he's out of touch with reality, he's floating off into bubble, as Newsweek went with, right? These are character judgments, all right, about the personality that voters make. Instead of fully informing themselves about their policy positions, they make up their minds about who to vote for based on these readily available kind of symbols. And unfortunately, what you have with science is something very similar, right? When you're talking about the mass public, when you're talking about the wider public, outside of what you might consider to be the attentive public for science and technology, all right, the stakeholders surrounding a single issue, right? You can think about the public aligned across two axes. Either they have high levels of information, low levels of information, high levels of engagement in terms of involvement, or low levels of engagement. And unfortunately, when you think about the mass public, most of the mass public sits here, right, at low levels of engagement and low levels of information. And as I'll talk about, the nature of the media system is that the public is receiving information about science either through local television news or through fictionalized narratives, such as, in this case, this is Terminator 3 dealing with the issue of nanotechnology. All right? You also have a smaller segment of the public, right, that are engaging with high information sources, but they're not politically active or they're not mobilized on the issue. They're low levels of engagement. So you have articles in the Science Times, you have Scientific American, right? But then you have a much smaller segment of the public that might be politically active through things like this is the Greenpeace website, right? High levels of engagement, right? But fairly low levels of information, oftentimes maybe misinformation, right? Both from the right and the left on these science issues. And then you have the smallest segment of the public that are both highly engaged and highly informed. And this is the type of citizen that turns out at these small-scale deliberative forums in what is considered the alternative public engagement model. Okay, so just a couple examples across issues. If you move from technical knowledge to thinking about what is the type of knowledge that your average citizen would want them to know in making up their minds about stem cell policy. All right, so this is a survey that I did. I contracted with the Survey Research Institute at Cornell University, which they gave me a cut rate because my older brother is working on his dissertation as the assistant manager there, so it's always nice to have it. You know, I recruited him back to graduate school. You know, now he's both a co-author and also I take advantage of his services. But in any case, we asked people in the survey in 2005 if they could correctly identify what Bush's decision about stem cell policy was in 2001, if they could correctly identify what the outcome of the California proposition was in 2004, if they could correctly identify the reason why scientists believe embryonic stem cell research is so important, whether they knew or not whether there was legislation in the United States regulating cloning, and if they could answer that the one that they wrong the most was very few people could identify the acronym for the National Institutes of Health. And as you can see, the distribution on this question is very low. So the mean is 1.8. And in fact, actually, very few people got all 5 answers correct, almost none. So levels of public knowledge about what we try to, from a validity standpoint, we try to say, well, what are the essential bits of knowledge that people should know about stem cell policy is very low. All right? And so what people rely on, instead of being fully informed, are these information shortcuts. Right? And one of the information shortcuts are frames. Right? These are packages. These are thought organizers that are out there in the mass media. Right? Every issue is very complex and has multiple dimensions, and I'll talk about examples of frames across issues. Right? But frames are thought organizers, packages, schema that people use for making up their minds about an issue with little or no other information. All right, so citizens often make up their minds about complex issues based on just those frames or interpretations that are most readily available out in the mass media, in combination, right, with their underlying religious values, ideology, or partisanship. And strategists know this, right? Political consultants, people that work in public affairs PR, right, that are hired to work on these campaigns, they know that this is how the public, the mass public, makes up their mind. And they actively lobby the media to get these strategic frames out there and to dominate the media with a single type of interpretation. Okay, so this is one of the dominant interpretations about science generally, is that science leads to social progress, right? It will make our lives better. And this is how the Juvenile Diabetes Research Foundation asked about stem cell research in early 2001. Right? They carefully framed the question in a way that accented this idea that research will lead to cures. Right? So they focus on this idea that do you support embryonic stem cell research that would lead to cures for such as Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, cancer, heart disease, arthritis, burns, or spinal cord problems. And what's interesting is that if defined in the question this way, 65% of the public says yes. Right? But at about the same time, the National Conference of Catholic Bishops asked the question in a different way, that framed the issue not emphasizing social progress and the possibility of cures, but rather focusing it around this idea of religious morality, closely matching the issue to the issue of abortion. Right? The live embryos would be destroyed in the first week of development. This was spring 2001, and not surprisingly, they got almost the exact opposite response. Right? More than 70% opposed. Right? So these question wordings across polls are interesting kind of experiments. It tells you that if in the media environment the definition of the issue moved away from social progress to religious morality, right? If that became the dominant interpretation, there would be swings in public opinion. Thankfully, the case was just the opposite, which we'll talk about. But all right, so what's happened since 2001 is that research advocates, Coalition of Advancement of Medical Research, also because of the deaths of Ronald Reagan and Christopher Reeve, the interpretations out there about stem cell research had been framed around, more so since 2001, around these ideas of research will lead to social progress and cures, and research is good for the economy, right? Positive interpretations about the issue. And what's happened in the aggregate is that public opinion has moved to slight majority levels when thinking about research on leftover embryos. But where most of that movement has come from, right, is from Democrats and independents, whereas Republicans and evangelicals have remained anchored in their views. Why? Because their religious values and their partisanship are very strong perceptual lenses, and these alternative interpretations of the issue around social progress and economic development do not resonate with their underlying values, right? So they don't accept that argument. They may not even pay attention to this type of coverage. And so across multiple poll indicators, not only Pew, but also with Gallup, when you ask people, is embryonic stem cell research morally acceptable? What's interesting is 2004 is the breaking point. Why? Because in 2004, during the election, because John Kerry campaigned on stem cell research, right? The issue was a very strong cue that this suddenly could be reinterpreted as a partisan issue. Democrats against Republicans, right? Democrats and Republicans did take that cue, and you see this sharp change in 2004 in terms of estimates of the moral acceptability between Democrats and Republicans. For the first time, there was this clear breaking point between Democrats and Republicans and how they thought about the issue. All right, and this is based on a paper that I published in the International Journal of Public Opinion Research, where we used a multivariate model to try to control out things like levels of education, gender, other type of confounding effects. And we looked at the statistical interaction, right? Do views about embryonic stem cell research vary by religious predisposition? And here this is, you find that for relatively non-religious to moderate religious Americans, right, and using polling from the Virginia Commonwealth University survey they do on the life sciences, right, the more they report hearing about embryonic stem cell research, right, their opinions change in support, where among the strongly religious, right, there's little change, right, after all controls statistically. Okay, so thinking about global warming, a similar type of situation happens, right? Levels of knowledge about public policy in the science of global warming are very low. In fact, actually, there's a lot of misinformation out there about global warming. Right, so this is the most recent poll from PIPA, which is the Public Policy Institute at University of Maryland that does a lot of national surveys on international attitudes and have done a lot of surveys on global warming. As you can see, all right, when asked about their views about scientific consensus, which of the following statements is closest to your opinion? There is a consensus among the great majority of scientists that global warming exists and could do significant damage. There is a consensus among the great majority of scientists that global warming does not exist and therefore poses no significant threat. Scientists are divided on the existence of global warming and its impact, right? 39% say scientists are divided. Only 53%, a slight majority of the public, say that there's a consensus view on global warming. What's perhaps worse is that the public is unaware of exactly what George W. Bush decided on Kyoto in 2001, right? So when asked across years since 2002, is that do you know whether George W. Bush has decided that the U.S. will continue to support the global warming agreement enacted in Kyoto, Japan, or has he decided to withdraw U.S. support, right? Only 42% know correctly that he decided to withdraw U.S. support from Kyoto. And this with only changes within the margin of error across these years. What this means is given low levels of information about the policy involved in the specifics of global warming, they're subject to framing effects. So ABC News in 2001 asked people about whether the U.S. should participate in Kyoto or not. And when they asked people, they asked the survey question correctly. They presented a two-sided argument, right? So they presented arguments for and against Kyoto. So some people say this would hurt the U.S. economy and based on uncertain science. Others say this is needed to protect the environment and could create new business opportunities. What's your view? Do you think the United States should or should not join this treaty requiring less emissions from U.S. power plants and cars, right? When presented with that two-sided statement in question, more than 60% of the public said, yes, we should join Kyoto. However, what's interesting is that Harris, around the same time in 2001, well, just after Bush made his decision, they asked it only in a one-sided way, right? In this way, this is a focus on how the Bush administration framed Kyoto, and they framed it around as Chris details in his book, right? That it's not based on sound research. They emphasize scientific uncertainty, right? And that would be damaging to the economy, right? And when presented with that one-sided argument, and what's interesting is this is just from a subsegment of that sample, which means it was only asked of the people that had heard about the issue, right? So they're somewhat more politically sophisticated. For these people, framing effects should be lower, but it still played out in terms that 40% said right, 45% said wrong, right? So very different from the two-sided type question in terms of response, 60% favoring participation in Kyoto. Just need to, my mouth's getting a little dry.